Welcome, everyone, to this deep dive.
Yeah.
I know this one might be a little heavy, but we're going to tackle a really important topic today, and that is the potential for authoritarianism and maybe even state collapse here in the United States.
Wow.
Now, I know that sounds pretty intense and even alarming to some folks,
Yeah.
but I think the goal here isn't to scare anybody. The goal is to equip all of us with the knowledge to spot warning signs and understand the potential scenarios that experts are laying out.
Right.
So we're not going to get bogged down in jargon or fear-mongering, I promise you.
Yeah.
We're just going to break this down together step by step
Okay.
and look at the facts. So to do this deep dive, we're going to be using expert analysis, hypothetical scenarios, even some historical parallels, even some image suggestions that are designed to make these really abstract concepts a little bit more tangible.
Interesting.
So there's some pretty juicy stuff in here, folks. We're going to talk about things like the Hungary model versus the Somalia model of governance failure. Pretty wild stuff. And then we're going to get into the role of propaganda and corporate influence in all of this and how that could potentially play out.
Fascinating.
And maybe even the possibility of an incompetent authoritarian accidentally triggering state collapse.
Yeah. I mean, look, the sources you've shared paint a pretty, unsettling picture, to be honest. The global trend towards democratic erosion. It's a real thing, and it's happening. And the U.S., despite its, long history of democracy, is not immune.
No, absolutely. And what's interesting is that one of the sources actually lays out 5 stages to dictatorship.
Yeah.
And it's really chilling when you start to look at how some of these stages are already playing out
Yeah.
right here in the U.S. So let's dive into that a little bit. The first stage, they talk about eroding trust in democratic institutions.
Right.
Like elections, the press, and the courts. You see this with the constant claims of voter fraud, despite a lack of any real evidence or labeling any media that's critical as fake news.
It's like a classic playbook, Sow those seeds of doubt in the very systems that are supposed to protect our democracy.
Right. It's not just rhetoric, though, right? We're seeing actual proposals and actions that align with these stages.
Absolutely. I mean, take Project 2025, for example.
What is that?
It's a plan. It's a blueprint put forward by the Heritage Foundation, and they basically want to replace career civil servants with, loyalists, essentially politicizing the entire bureaucracy.
Wow. So that lines up with that second stage then, right?
Yeah.
The consolidating of executive power.
Exactly. And that ties in with that unitary executive theory we've been hearing about.
Which is basically arguing that the president has almost unlimited power, right?
Well, yeah, it's a controversial interpretation of the Constitution, to say the least.
Mm-hmm.
But it basically seeks to expand presidential powers at the expense of Congress and the courts. And Project 2025 specifically advocates for this.
So it's like they're not just trying to win elections, they're trying to change the whole game.
They want to rewrite the rules.
No. Yeah, it's like a slow motion coup almost.
It's funny you should say that, because one of the sources actually used the analogy of a boiling frog.
Oh, yeah.
If you throw a frog in boiling water, it'll jump right out. But if you slowly heat the water, the frog won't even realize it's happening until it's too late.
It's cooked.
Exactly. And that's what we're seeing here. These small changes that seem insignificant on their own can add up to a huge shift in the political landscape.
Right. And that's why it's so important to be aware of these incremental steps towards authoritarianism. So speaking of pathways to authoritarianism, the sources also compare 2 potential outcomes of this whole process. They call it the Hungary model and the Somalia model.
Right. It's a pretty stark contrast.
So what's the difference between these 2 models?
Well, the Hungary model is kind of exemplified by Viktor Orbán's regime in Hungary. It's basically a controlled top-down authoritarianism. He's systematically dismantled their democratic institutions, rigged elections, controls the media. But, Hungary still maintains a semblance of order. It's repressive, but there's still a functioning state.
Yeah, so authoritarianism with a veneer of stability.
Yeah, something like that. Now, the Somalia model, on the other hand, is the complete opposite.
Okay.
Total state collapse, lawlessness, violence, no functioning government.
Okay. So basically anarchy.
Basically. And what's really concerning is that the sources suggest that an American president attempting the Hungary model could accidentally trigger the Somalia model.
Oh, wait, so they could try to seize power but end up destroying the very system they're trying to control.
That's the theory. They might overreach, alienate key allies, trigger economic collapse, or even provoke a military backlash. And then you have this fragmentation of power with private militias and corporations filling the void.
And we've already seen hints of that, haven't we?
Yeah.
Like armed groups protesting the act on the Capitol.
Right. And then you add in the fact that there are over 393 million firearms in civilian hands in the U.S.
Oh, wow.
So the potential for things to spiral out of control is very real.
That's a chilling thought. Okay, so we've got these potential pathways to authoritarianism. But what makes the U.S. vulnerable in the first place? Why would people even consider giving up their freedoms?
Well, the sources point to a number of factors. One is this growing loss of faith in democratic institutions. Years of gridlock corruption, partisan bickering. It's eroded public trust in government.
Yeah, people feel like the system's rigged. Their voices don't matter. Nothing ever changes.
Right. And that's where the appeal of a strongman leader comes in, someone who promises simple solutions, bypasses all the messy democratic processes, and just gets things done.
It's a very seductive narrative,
Yeah.
especially when people are feeling anxious and uncertain about the future.
Absolutely. And the sources also highlight economic anxiety as a key factor. When people are struggling to make ends meet, they're more likely to accept authoritarian solutions if they think it'll bring economic security, even if it means sacrificing some of their freedoms.
Right, the classic trade-off, freedom for security. And history shows us that rarely ends well.
Another factor is fear of cultural and demographic change. The U.S. is becoming more diverse, and some people feel threatened by that. They fear losing their cultural dominance, their way of life.
And politicians often exploit that fear, don't they?
Absolutely. They scapegoat minorities. Immigrants create this us versus them dynamic.
Yeah.
They present themselves as defenders of the real America, promising to protect the interests of a shrinking majority.
And that rhetoric can be very powerful, even if it's based on fear and prejudice.
It's very effective. And then you add in the role of right-wing media and these social media algorithms that amplify these fears and grievances, create these echo chambers where people are constantly exposed to misinformation and propaganda.
Right, it's a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
The more they're exposed to it, the more they believe it.
Yeah.
And the more likely they are to support those authoritarian solutions.
It's important to note that it's not just about right-wing media. The sources also acknowledge the potential for authoritarian tendencies on the left as well.
Yeah.
It might not be as prevalent in the U.S. right now, but any ideology taken to its extreme can become dangerous.
Right. We need to be vigilant about all forms of extremism, regardless of where it falls on the political spectrum.
Absolutely. So we've got this really combustible mix of social, economic, and political factors. But the sources also point to two key groups that are actively pushing us towards authoritarianism: corporations and religious organizations.
Okay, let's start with corporate influence. They use this term corporate capture, which sounds kind of ominous. What does that even mean?
Well, it refers to the way corporations exert undue influence over government policies and institutions, to benefit their own interests, often at the expense of the public good.
So we're talking about lobbying, campaign contributions, regulatory capture, things like that.
Exactly. And the sources suggest that this corporate influence is a major contributor to the erosion of democratic norms.
Can you give us some specific examples of what this corporate capture looks like in action?
Well, one example is the fossil fuel industry's influence on climate policy. Despite overwhelming scientific evidence, these corporations have spent millions lobbying against any regulations that would address climate change.
Right.
They're prioritizing their profits over the health of the planet.
And they've been incredibly successful at it. It's like they've captured the entire political system. What about other industries?
Well, another example is the pharmaceutical industry's influence on drug pricing. They've lobbied heavily to prevent Medicare from negotiating drug prices. So Americans end up paying way more for medication than people in other developed countries.
It's all about maximizing profits, even if it hurts ordinary people. So what about religious organizations? How are they contributing to this trend towards authoritarianism?
The sources focus specifically on Christian nationalist groups, which have become increasingly powerful in right-wing politics.
Okay, so what is Christian nationalism exactly, and why is it such a concern?
Well, it's basically this ideology that seeks to merge Christian beliefs with American identity in politics. They believe that America was founded as a Christian nation and that its laws and policies should reflect Christian values.
So they're trying to impose their religious beliefs on everyone else?
Essentially, yes. And that's a huge threat to the separation of church and state, one of the fundamental principles of American democracy.
Right, and the sources suggest that these groups are actively supporting authoritarian leaders and policies.
Yeah, they see these leaders as protectors of their values and a bulwark against what they perceive as a secular liberal attack on their way of life.
So they're willing to sacrifice democratic principles to advance their religious agenda? That's pretty scary.
Yeah.
So we've got corporations trying to rig the system for their own benefit and religious groups seeking to impose their beliefs on the entire country. It's a pretty grim picture. Where does that leave us? Is there any hope?
Well, there's always hope, but it requires us to really understand the problem and actively work to counteract these trends. We were talking about Project 2025. That's not just some theoretical framework. It's a detailed plan with specific steps, and some of them are already being implemented.
You're saying this isn't some far-fetched dystopian fantasy. This is a real plan that people are putting into action right now.
Yeah, and it's gaining traction in certain circles. The Heritage Foundation, the organization behind Project 2025, is a very influential conservative think tank. They have close ties to the Republican Party, and they've already had some success in shaping policy and influencing appointments.
Okay, so what are some of the specific things that Project 2025 is advocating for? And how do those things actually erode democratic norms?
One of their key goals is to shrink the federal government and concentrate power in the executive branch, specifically in a president who aligns with their ideology. They basically see the federal bureaucracy as bloated, inefficient, and filled with people who are opposed to their agenda. They call them deep state operatives.
So it's about consolidating power, but it's also about purging the government of anyone who doesn't agree with them. This sounds pretty authoritarian.
It is. It's a classic authoritarian tactic. Control the levers of power and eliminate any potential opposition. Project 2025 actually recommends firing career civil servants and replacing them with loyalists who will just carry out the president's directives without question.
So it's like they're trying to create a parallel government that operates outside the traditional checks and balances.
Yeah, you could say that. And it's not just about personnel. They also want to defund or dismantle entire government agencies that they see as obstacles to their agenda.
Like, which agencies are we talking about?
Well, they've specifically mentioned the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Education, even the FBI. They see these agencies as promoting liberal or globalist agendas that they oppose.
So it's not just about consolidating power. It's about using that power to reshape American society according to their worldview. That's kind of terrifying.
And the sources actually point to historical examples of how this kind of ideological takeover can lead to the suppression of dissent, the erosion of civil liberties, and the rise of authoritarianism.
Okay, this is all pretty alarming stuff. But what can we do about it? Is there any way to stop this train before it goes off the rails?
Well, the first step is awareness. The more people understand the threat, the better equipped they'll be to resist it. So we need to educate ourselves and others about Project 2025 and these broader trends towards authoritarianism.
So knowledge is power.
Exactly. We need to understand the tactics being used, the motivations behind them, and the potential consequences. We also need to be vigilant about specific actions and policies that align with this agenda.
Okay, so what are some red flags that we should be looking out for?
Well, one big red flag is the appointment of loyalists to key positions, especially those with little experience or qualifications. Another is the use of executive orders to bypass Congress and implement controversial policies.
We've definitely seen a lot of that lately.
Another warning sign is the rhetoric used by politicians and media figures. Pay attention to language that demonizes opponents, undermines democratic institutions, or glorifies authoritarian leaders.
Like that strongman narrative we were talking about.
Exactly. It's seductive, but it's dangerous. We need to be very critical of those who promise simple solutions to complex problems, especially if those solutions involve concentrating power and limiting freedoms.
So we need to pay attention to the language being used, the policies being implemented, and the people being appointed. But what about concrete actions? What can ordinary citizens actually do to push back against these trends?
Well, one of the most important things we can do is support organizations that are fighting for democratic values.
Like the ACLU Common Cause, the Brennan Center for Justice, those kinds of groups.
Exactly. Those organizations are working hard to protect voting rights, hold corporations accountable, defend the rule of law, promote transparency in government.
So donating, volunteering, even just spreading the word about their work can make a difference.
Absolutely. And we need to get involved in our communities. Attend local government meetings, contact our elected officials, speak out against injustice whenever we see it.
It's about taking ownership of our democracy and not letting it be dismantled without a fight.
Exactly. And remember, we're not alone in this. There are millions of people across the country who are committed to defending democratic values. We need to connect with each other, build coalitions, and mobilize our collective power.
That's a really powerful message. It's easy to feel powerless when you're facing these huge challenges. But you're right, there's strength in numbers. We can make a difference if we work together.
Absolutely. And remember, those in power rely on apathy and division. When people are engaged, informed, and united, they're much harder to control.
As we're talking about all of this, I can't help but think about the psychology behind it all. What makes people vulnerable to this kind of authoritarian appeal? Why are they willing to give up their freedoms for a promise of security or stability?
That's a great question, and it's one that psychologists and political scientists have been studying for a long time. There are a number of factors that contribute to this susceptibility.
Like what?
Well, one factor is a need for certainty and order. People who are drawn to authoritarian leaders often can't tolerate ambiguity and complexity. They crave simple solutions and clear lines of authority.
So in times of crisis or rapid change, they're more likely to look for a strong leader who promises to take charge and restore order.
Exactly. And that's why authoritarian movements often gain traction during periods of social or economic upheaval. When people are feeling anxious and insecure, they're more likely to be swayed by a charismatic leader who offers a sense of security and purpose.
It's like they're trading their freedom for the illusion of safety.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. Another factor is fear of the other. Authoritarian leaders often exploit existing prejudices and fears. They scapegoat minorities or outsiders and create this sense of threat that justifies their authoritarian measures.
We've seen that happen over and over again throughout history.
Absolutely. The Nazis blamed the Jews for Germany's economic problems. The Hutus blamed the Tutsis for Rwanda's social unrest. And today, we see right-wing politicians in the U.S. and Europe scapegoating immigrants and Muslims.
It's classic divide and conquer.
Yeah.
Create an enemy, stoke fear and resentment, and then present yourself as the only one who can protect the people from this perceived threat.
Exactly, and it can be incredibly effective, especially when people are feeling vulnerable and uncertain. Another factor is a lack of critical thinking skills. People who are susceptible to authoritarian appeals often have trouble distinguishing between fact and fiction, between credible sources of information and propaganda.
So they're more likely to fall for conspiracy theories, misinformation, and emotional appeals instead of looking at objective evidence and reasoned arguments.
Right, and that's where education and media literacy are so important. We need to give people the tools to think, critically evaluate information, and recognize propaganda and disinformation.
So it's about teaching people to think for themselves, to question authority, and to demand evidence.
Exactly. And it's about promoting a culture of skepticism and critical inquiry, where people are encouraged to challenge assumptions and seek out diverse perspectives.
So it's not just about protecting our institutions. It's also about developing a mindset that's resistant to authoritarian appeals.
Absolutely. And that's something we can all work on both individually and collectively.
This deep dive has really opened my eyes. I feel like I'm starting to grasp the complexity of this issue in a way I hadn't before.
I'm glad to hear that. It is a complex issue, but it's also one that we can't afford to ignore. The future of our democracy depends on our willingness to engage with these challenges and work together to find solutions.
And part of that engagement involves understanding the media's role in all of this.
Yeah.
The sources you shared really highlight how the media can be both a weapon and a shield in the fight against authoritarianism.
That's a great point. The media is incredibly powerful in shaping public opinion and influencing the political landscape. It can inform and empower citizens, or it can manipulate and control them.
So on the one hand, we have independent media outlets that are committed to holding power accountable, exposing corruption, and providing accurate, unbiased information. But then we also have media outlets that are actively promoting authoritarian agendas, spreading propaganda, and sowing division.
Exactly, and it's getting harder and harder to tell them apart. We're living in this age of information overload where anyone with an internet connection can publish content and reach a global audience.
Why?
And that's created a perfect breeding ground for misinformation, conspiracy theories, and propaganda.
It's like we're drowning in information, but we're starving for truth.
Yeah.
So how do we navigate this landscape? How do we figure out which sources are trustworthy and which ones are trying to manipulate us?
It's definitely not easy, but there are some things we can do. First, we need to be aware of our own biases. We all have them, and they can affect how we interpret information. It's important to be critical of sources that just confirm our existing beliefs and try to seek out different perspectives.
So don't just read or watch news that reinforces your worldview. Challenge yourself to engage with different viewpoints, even if they make you uncomfortable.
Exactly. Another important step is to check the credibility of sources. Look for outlets that have a reputation for accuracy, fairness, and fact-checking. Be wary of sources that rely on anonymous sources, unnamed experts, or emotional appeals.
So don't just believe everything you read on social media or see on cable news. Do your own research. Check multiple sources and be skeptical of claims that seem too good to be true or too outrageous to be believed.
That's a great point. And it's also important to pay attention to the funding and ownership of media outlets. Who's paying for this content? What are their motivations? Are they transparent about their biases?
So if a media outlet is owned by a corporation or a political party, we should be extra careful about the information they're presenting.
Absolutely. There's a good chance they're pushing an agenda, whether consciously or unconsciously. And finally, don't underestimate the power of your own critical thinking skills. Ask questions, challenge assumptions, and demand evidence. Don't just passively consume information, actively engage with it.
That's good advice.
Yeah.
It's about taking responsibility for our own information intake and becoming more discerning consumers of news.
Right. And it's an ongoing process. We always need to be working on our critical thinking skills and media literacy.
Because the stakes are high. The media can be a powerful force for democracy, or it can be a weapon used against it.
Exactly. And it's up to each of us to make sure we're using it responsibly and that we're not being manipulated by those who want to take away our freedoms.
Okay, so we've talked about the dangers of authoritarianism, the tactics they use to erode democratic norms, the psychological factors that make people susceptible to these appeals, and the media's role in shaping public opinion. But I think it's important to remember that there are people and organizations out there who are actively fighting back, working to defend democracy and promote a more just and equitable society.
Absolutely. There are so many people and organizations working hard to protect our rights, hold power accountable, and push for social progress. We need to support those efforts, amplify their voices, and join them in this fight for a better future.
Can you give us some examples of these individuals and organizations?
Sure, groups like the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the NAACP have been fighting for civil rights and social justice for decades. They're on the front lines of the battle against discrimination, hate speech, and voter suppression.
And they're not just fighting in court, they're also educating the public, advocating for policy changes, and mobilizing communities to take action.
Exactly. And there are tons of grassroots organizations all over the country working at the local level to tackle issues like poverty, homelessness, environmental justice, and criminal justice reform. These groups are often led by people who have been directly affected by these problems, and they're working to create a more just and equitable society for everyone.
So it's not just about resisting authoritarianism, it's also about building a better world.
Right. And those two goals are really intertwined. We can't have a truly democratic society without social and economic justice, and we can't achieve social and economic justice without a strong and vibrant democracy.
It's about creating a positive feedback loop, a society where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, where their voices are heard and their rights are respected.
Exactly. And that's a society worth fighting for.
Absolutely. So what are some things that listeners can do to get involved and support these efforts?
Well, the first thing is to stay informed. Read news from reliable sources, follow organizations and activists on social media, learn about the issues that you care about.
So knowledge is power, as we said before. But what about taking it a step further?
Well, once you're informed, you can start taking action. Donate to organizations, volunteer your time, attend protests and rallies, contact your elected officials, talk to your friends and family about these issues.
So it's about using your voice and your actions to make a difference.
Exactly. And remember, even small actions can have a big impact. Every phone call, every email, every donation, every conversation can help build a more just and equitable society.
It's like creating a ripple effect. Each individual action spreads outward and inspires others to take action too.
And those ripples can eventually become waves that can transform our society.
So even though the challenges are huge, we shouldn't lose hope. We have the power to make a difference and we need to use it.
I agree. The future is not set in stone. It's up to us to create the kind of world we want to live in. And that starts with each of us taking action, no matter how small it may seem.
That's a great message to end on. We can't just sit back and wait for someone else to save us. We need to be the change we want to see in the world.
And that change starts with each of us.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about these big systemic threats to democracy.
Right.
But I'm also thinking about like the personal side of all of this, you know?
What do you mean?
Well, like what makes someone susceptible to these authoritarian appeals in the first place?
Yeah.
What would push someone to trade their freedom for that illusion of security, you know?
Yeah.
Some of the sources had some really striking images, like everyday scenes that were just warped into something dystopian.
Yeah, they were meant to evoke that kind of visceral reaction.
Yeah, for sure. Like that one with the Capitol building in ruins. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
or the corporate boardroom transformed into like a government center.
Right.
And those surveillance drones over familiar streets. You know, it really hits home that this isn't just some abstract political theory.
Yeah, these aren't just ideas. They have real consequences that could impact all of us.
And the sources really highlighted the role of propaganda and disinformation in all this.
Absolutely. Those are like key tools for any aspiring authoritarian leader.
It's almost like some people want to believe these alternate realities,
Yeah.
even if they're based on lies and fear-mongering.
It's a really complex psychological phenomenon.
For sure.
One of the sources suggested that people are just craving certainty and order, especially in times of crisis or when things are changing really fast.
Yeah, so a strong man who comes in promising simple solutions, that can be really appealing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Even if those solutions are actually harmful in the long run.
It's like they're just handing over the reins, giving up their responsibility to think critically.
And that's exactly how authoritarian regimes take root. It's a gradual process of surrendering individual agency to this perceived higher authority.
It's wild. One of the sources actually used the term useful idiots to describe these followers.
Oof. Yeah, it's a harsh term.
Yeah.
But it does highlight the danger of just blindly following these charismatic leaders without questioning their motives or their methods.
Right, and it's not just a right-wing phenomenon either, right?
No, not at all. Authoritarian tendencies can pop up anywhere on the political spectrum.
Yeah, so it's not enough to just be wary of one ideology. We need to be on guard against all forms of extremism.
Exactly.
So what can we do? Like, what's the antidote to all of this? How do we build resilience against authoritarianism on a personal level?
I think it starts with critical thinking. We have to be willing to question our own assumptions, challenge our own biases, and seek out different points of view.
So don't just consume information that reinforces what you already believe.
Exactly. You got to expose yourself to different perspectives, even if they make you a little uncomfortable.
Right. The sources also talked a lot about the need for media literacy.
Yeah, that's crucial these days.
We need to be able to tell fact from fiction, to spot propaganda and disinformation when we see it.
And that takes effort. You can't just passively absorb whatever's thrown at you through social media or biased news sources.
Right. It's like we need to develop this healthy skepticism, like a filter that helps us sort through all the noise and figure out what's actually reliable.
Exactly. We should always be asking ourselves, who's saying this? Why are they saying it? What evidence do they have?
Right. And it's not enough to just be skeptical of information that challenges our beliefs. We have to apply that same level of scrutiny to stuff that confirms our biases, too.
Absolutely. It's about constantly questioning, evaluating, seeking out multiple perspectives.
Yeah, and recognizing those emotional manipulation tactics that some folks use to exploit our fears and prejudices.
Oh, yeah. Fear is a powerful motivator.
For sure.
And it can be used to shut down critical thinking and make people more open to those authoritarian solutions.
So we need to be aware of those emotional triggers and make sure we're not letting fear or anger drive our decisions.
Right. We got to stay grounded in reason, evidence, and a commitment to those core democratic values.
It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all of this. It can feel like we're up against these massive forces.
I know what you mean.
But I think it's important to remember that we're not alone in this fight.
We're not. There are so many people who share these values and are working hard to defend democracy.
And there are organizations out there fighting every day to protect our rights, hold the powerful accountable, and build a more just world.
That's right. So we can't afford to give in to despair or cynicism.
Yeah, we have to stay engaged, informed, and active in our communities.
Because ultimately, the future of our democracy rests on all of our shoulders.
This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive.
It really has.
I feel like I have a much clearer understanding now of the challenges ahead, but also the tools we have to fight back.
I hope so.
And to everyone listening out there, remember, you're not powerless.
You have a voice, and you have power.
Stay informed, stay engaged, and never give up on fighting for the kind of world you want to live in.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.